here we are with part 3 of our acrylic painting demo, Spring Walk, and I'm Karen Alari. What we're working on right now is our bank of winter trees off to the right. These trees don't have any blossoms on them yet, and they're basically just going to be a backdrop for the pink blossoms on our foreground tree. So I'm just mixing up many different shades of gray to use in this area, and I'm building up texture. One thing I wanted to remember about this area is I want to keep the gray on the cool side if I can, because if that gray is cooler, the warm blossoms will stand out more strongly against them, and it will highlight those blossoms better. But at this point, I'm just mixing different shades of gray, a little redder, a little bluer, a little greener, a little lighter, and rolling this foliage in. And this is the technique I use primarily for foliage. Is I use a small bristle brush. This is a number 2 round, and I hold it on the side and I hold it very loosely in my fingertips, and I tap it and I roll it with increasing amounts of paint on the brush. In other words, as you start the first layers and as you do the block in, the paint is much thinner and you just not as much of it on the brush, and I scrub it more into the canvas so it's very flat. But as I move forward and putting my finishing brush strokes on a certain area, I have more paint on my brush and I use a lighter touch and just lay that paint on top. Now I've mixed a blue color, a sky blue color, to go back in and make the tops of these trees a little more airy. My overall concept of this painting is trying to get across the lightness and the airiness of a spring morning. So I have to make sure that none of my areas in the painting are too heavy or cumbersome. So one way, I do this often in trees. We call this, putting in the sky holes, because you're basically putting in sky color back on top of the tree to make them lighter. And the only thing you need to think about is when you're putting in sky holes, they're generally a little bit darker than your actual sky color in order for them to look natural. If they're just as light as the sky, they pop out too brightly. So I've mixed a darker gray again, and I'm establishing those vertical tree trunks. This was just very thin lines. I don't want the eye to be drawn over here, but I want enough strong verticals and enough dark colors in there to balance a little bit, because I have this big dark tree on the left hand side of the painting and I need to make sure it's a little bit balanced. So this little line of trees was just, it's going to march us back into the painting, and it's going to provide this backdrop. I love painting foliage, and I love trees, and just looking at that reference photo and being surprised at how many colors and how many shades you can find in nature, and something that you would just say, oh, that's just a great tree. But when you really stop and look at it, it's just amazing how beautiful the world is and how much joy you can get just looking at it. So here I've come back with a lighter gray. I'm laying in these light colors, and you can see as I put my brush strokes in, again, these are double time, so it's faster than my brush strokes would normally be. But I'll lay them in and then I'll come back like I'm doing now. I'm come back with a clean brush with just water on it, and I'm softening out some of the edges. In other words, I'm just scrubbing along the edges so there aren't any sharp lines, any sharp marks at the edge of this foliage, because this is a background. If If you have sharp edges in something that's a long ways away or something that you don't really want your eye to go to, it will draw your eye. A sharp edge will draw your eye. And so you have to be very careful of the nature of the edges that you put in and make sure they're working for you, not against you. And in acrylic paint, you have just a minute or two to do that. Once you put the stroke down, you can come in with a clean brush, a little water on it, and soften whichever edge you want to soften. But you can't dally. You have to come in and do it right away. There's a little bit of a green. The green fields continue back behind these trees, so I'm adding in that little bit of green back there. Tends to marry those two areas, so it isn't just a big block of gray and then a big block of green, but you have some of the green in the gray area, and it tends to unify the painting a little more. Coming back with a warmer, as much as I wanted to keep the gray and the foliage cool where it's going to be behind the blossoms of the tree, once I get down here to the bottom of this tree area, I'm adding some red back into it. I'm warming up this gray. I also want it to be a little redder right here against the green grass. So whenever you put two complementary colors together, complementary being opposite on the color wheel, and red is the opposite of green. So whenever you want an area to stand out even more, you can put it next to the complementary color, and that will make it vibrate out a little bit more. So I just really subtly warmed up that gray at the bottom next to the green with some Alizarin Crimson, which is a red color, in order to do that, because I really think the blossoms and the spring green are really what define spring to me. And so those are in effect the focal point of this painting. So that's one way you highlight a focal point, is by having complementary colors near each other. You notice I use my paper towel quite often. I'll mix up the paint color, and this is just something that you get used to as you go on in painting, but you want to have the right amount of paint on your brush. And so I often use my paper towel to take off the excess paint, so I don't just lay down a big glob if I don't want to. And it also, if I'm using the same color, I don't have to continually go back to the water and rinsing it off that way. I can just wipe it off with my paper towel in order to get the brush stroke that I want, basically. Here I'd redefined the sky a little bit. Didn't want that straight diagonal line coming down. I wanted to show the edge of that foreground group of trees, and then there's a back bank of trees as well, so I wanted that distinction in the sky. It's amazing how many colors of gray you can make, and when you do a winter painting, I was just doing a winter painting, and it's just really almost entirely gray, but it's amazing how many different colors of gray there are and how beautiful those subtle changes can be, which we have the benefit as we're painting of being able to contemplate those and enjoy those and recreate those. And here I've gone back in and I've made a slightly lighter value of this background green evergreen. As you may have noticed, my dark tree is not standing out real strongly. The value between that dark background and the tree was almost the same. So in order to fix that and make the tree stand out, I'm lightening the green of this evergreen. I still want it to be darker than my blossoms so that it can help them to stand out, but I don't want them to be, I want it to be as dark as the tree. So I'm lightening up that green. It's just a very grayed green. In other words, in order to gray a green, you're going to add some red to it. And I'm using that green again to reestablish and to think some more about what form do I want this tree to make. Got a lot of water on my brush right now, and I'm softening up all those edges. I don't want to see any hard edges in this background tree. I just want it to be a soft mass of simple mass of soft color. And again, kind of a pastel-y color in a way. Again, having these quiet background areas so that our very busy foreground doesn't make the painting overwhelmingly busy. There was actually a lot more going on in this background in the reference photo, but that's the part where we learn to edit. So I'm just reestablishing this background hill, putting the final layers of paint on it in this bluish lavender color. And I'm softening the edge of the hillside. I just lay my brush on the side and poke upwards to give a little hint of tree tops along the top of that background hill. Don't want anything defined, just want to soften that edge and make it very subtle. So now we're going to move into our spring green field on the left. And we want it to read as spring green. We want it to be a pretty green, but we want it to be duller than the greens that we're going to put in the foreground. We don't want it to take precedence. So I'm using my Pthalo Blue, Cadmium Yellow, Ultramarine Blue, a little bit of Cad Red to dull it, and white. And now using that green background to get the final shape of the trunk I want. I want this to be kind of a thin, elegant, wispy tree, and that will also play into just the wispiness of spring. Again, going back to the concept or the idea that I'm trying to get across of springtime. And fields like this, it's just layer on layer of a little bit dark, a little bit lighter, a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. Tapping in some of that same green on the right hand side to unify the painting and to show the way the green field moves into the background. And I also put some of that up into the tree itself. Those winter trees all have that gray-green moss on them. So that will integrate the painting as well as giving a hint of that moss. You never want to have one color just in one spot on your painting. You want to move that color around into the painting in some other areas to unify the painting. Right at the edge of this field, just some random medium grays of brush and dried grass, and define the edge of that a little bit, and more of that dried grass along the roadside. I've made the bank of flowers much wider than it is in the reference photo, and added some off to the right, because those are really a big part of the painting, and the reason I'm doing the painting is those beautiful daffodils. So now that I've lightened up that background, you see when I come back in with my darkest dark, it's standing out much more clearly and distinctly against that background. And I've finally realized that I needed that overhanging branch to start lower down on the tree trunk. So now I'm pretty much completely off my reference photo. I'm just looking at that tree and trying to find a pretty shape. And I literally find it with my brush as I go along. And that is the end of part 3, and we will be moving along to part 4.